Much of Parshat Vayigash centers on Yosef's revelation to his brothers and the family reunion. Chapter 47, though, veers from this focus to talk instead about Yosef's economic policies in Egypt during the years of famine. And somewhat surprisingly, it does so in much detail. We are told how despite the fact that the Egyptians had given a fifth of their grain to be stored during the years of plenty, when famine strikes, they find themselves forced to give up all their money and cattle, and even offered themselves as slaves in order to buy food. Yosef takes all their land and a fifth of any future produce for Paro, and then implements a policy of population displacement. The short historical interlude raises many questions. First, we wonder, why is this story included in the Torah? Why does the Torah, which is frequently very sparse in its language, find it necessary to expound about Egyptian economic policies? Or, in the words of the Akedat Yitzchak, למה הוזכר כל זה העניין מחוק החמישית והעברת העם לערים וחוק הכהנים מאת פרעה? כי כל זה יאות להיכתב בספרי נימוסי מצרים, לא בתורה האלוקית. Why is the entire story of the law of the fifth and the transferring of the people to the cities and the law of the priests mentioned here? For this is fitting to be written in the Egyptian records, but not for the divine Torah. In other words, why include Egyptian economic history in the Torah? What is the reader supposed to learn from the passage? Second, how are we to evaluate Yosef's actions? At first glance, his economic measures seem overly severe. Was it really necessary to bankrupt all the Egyptians? Was there no other way of providing them with food? Especially considering that in the years of plenty, they had set aside a fifth of their own crops to supply Yosef's storehouses. Moreover, why did Yosef institute a policy of population displacement? What did this have to do with the food supply? Each of Yosef's actions make us wonder, did Yosef really need to employ such draconian measures to ensure proper distribution of the food? Or was he being unnecessarily harsh? A third set of questions relate to the way the story is told. The episode includes several details which are repeated more than once, making the reader question their import. In describing the impoverishment of the Egyptians, there is a threefold mention that in Canaan too money was scarce. Why does the Torah highlight this fact? What does it reveal about the overall economic situation of Canaan and the devastation caused there by the famine? Why is it relevant to the situation in Egypt? Second, the story of Yosef's economic policies is framed by details of Yosef's family settling and proliferating in Goshen. The literary sandwiching suggests that the Torah is trying to connect the two issues. What, though, is the point of the connection? Finally, the fact that the priests were exempt from selling their land to Paro is mentioned twice in this short unit. Why is this necessary? What is the reader supposed to learn from this point? In exploring our story, commentaries vary both in how they explain the presence of this episode in the Torah and in how they evaluate Yosef's policies. The vast majority of commentators suggest that the story not only casts Yosef in a positive light, but that this is the very reason for the story's inclusion in Torah, that the reader should better understand the nobility of Yosef's character and the wisdom of his deeds. As Ramban, a 13th century Spanish commentator, writes, סיפר הכתוב זה להודיע מעלות יוסף בחוכמה, בתבונה ובדעת, וכי היה איש אמונים, ומצא בזה חן גם כן בעיני העם. According to Ramban, the story shows how Yosef exercised wisdom in managing the crisis, and how his honest manner found him favor in the eyes of the Egyptians. Though Yosef's policies were harsh, this was from necessity. Austere measures were needed to ensure an adequate food supply without the raiding, corruption, and anarchy which often accompanies the stress of famine. The people didn't resent the measures, but they recognized that they were vital for survival. As they themselves say to Yosef, Hechayitanu, you have allowed us to live. Moreover, throughout, Yosef tries to ease the necessary hardships. Thus, Rav Shmuel ben Chafni Gaon, a 10th century Gaon of the Yeshiva in Pumbedita in Baghdad, maintains that Yosef offered to buy the Egyptians' cattle, not merely as payment for the food, but so that they would no longer need to feed them. As another example, Shadal, a 19th century Italian exegete, asserts that when displacing the people, Yosef made sure to move the Egyptians in large groups, city by city, so that their social ties remained intact. Ramban justifies Yosef's harshest measure, the enslavement of the Egyptians, by suggesting that actually it never happened. Even though the people offered themselves as slaves, Yosef did not accept their offer. He bought only their land, not their bodies, and instead hired them as tenant farmers. As evidence, Ramban points to the fact that after the people say, Knei otanu ve'et admatenu, buy us and our land, the verse simply states, Vayiken Yosef et kol admat Mitzrayim leParo, and Yosef bought all the land of Egypt for Paro, without mentioning the people's bodies. One might argue that nonetheless, later in the chapter, Yosef states, Hin kaniti etchem hayom ve'et admatchem leParo, behold, I have bought you and your land, suggesting that he indeed did buy the people as well. Ramban responds that this means that he bought the Egyptians only insofar as they were to work the land, or in other terms, he hired them to work the land. Ramban also raises the possibility that when Yosef initially gathered food during the years of plenty, he did so by buying it up rather than by expropriating it by royal fiat. Thus, later on, Yosef was not charging the Egyptians exorbitant prices for food which was rightfully theirs. Rather, Yosef emerges as a shrewd entrepreneur, buying low when the market was inundated with produce and selling at high profit margins when supplies were limited. Other details of the story similarly point to Yosef's worthy qualities. The verse, Ve'yaveh Yosef et hakesef beitza Paro, highlights Yosef's honesty. Yosef brought all the incomes from the sales to Paro's house, rather than storing it by him, to ensure that no one could even suspect him of taking anything for personal gain. According to Rabag, a 14th century Provençal commentator, the dual mention of the priestly exemption from selling the land is but another example of Yosef's wisdom. According to him, the Kohanim are not cultic priests, but important officers. Their exemption was an effort to keep the elite pleased so as to prevent rebellion. In contrast to Ramban and the other commentators we just discussed, Rashi focuses on how Yosef's actions aided not the Egyptians, but his own family. He suggests that Yosef's policy of population displacement eased the difficulties inherent in his family's immigration. Making everyone foreigners meant that the Israelites would not be treated as such. The Netziv, a 19th century Lithuanian commentator, adds that the policy cleared Goshen of its inhabitants, providing Yosef's family with an isolated area in which to live, so as to reduce the danger of their assimilation. This is consistent with the Netziv's repeated emphasis throughout his commentary on Sefer Shemot on the importance of the nation living alone in Egypt. He lauds Yosef for trying to prevent their assimilation and points out that it is only after his death that the nation leaves the confines of Goshen, the first step in their assimilation, and one of the reasons that the enslavement eventually begins. So according to this first approach, the story comes to demonstrate both Yosef's skill in handling the crisis and his concern for the welfare of his family, earning him the respect of all involved. However, not all agree with this reading of the story. Several modern scholars, following Rav Yosef Bechor Shor, a 12th century French Tosafist, view the very same actions from the opposite perspective, suggesting that Yosef's policies were overly harsh and that his favoritism towards his family backfired, ultimately paving the way for the Egyptian enslavement of the children of Israel. The story comes not to laud Yosef, but to provide the backdrop and maybe even blame him for the eventual bondage. According to this approach, when Yosef gathered the food during the years of plenty, he did so without compensating the Egyptian farmers, and perhaps even against their will. As such, when they were later forced to pay for what had originally belonged to them, the Egyptians were filled with bitterness. In addition, in contrast to Ramban, this position suggests that Yosef did enslave the people, further increasing their resentment. It is even possible that the severity of his actions began to foment rebellion, which might have been what led Yosef to displace the people, hoping that severing ties to land and social structures would reduce the chances of successful insurrections. However, it was not only the harsh measures that bothered the Egyptians, but also, and perhaps more so, the fact that Yosef's family were exempt from them. It was likely Yosef's nepotism and the favoritism he showed his family more than anything else, which led to the Egyptians' bitterness and accompanying jealousy. Rav Tamir Granot and Rav David Sabato suggest that the verses intentionally set up a series of contrasts between the fate of the Egyptians and that of Yaakov's family to highlight this point. While Yosef provided for his family so that they would have lechem lefi hataf, in Egypt there was no bread, v'lechem ein b'chol haaretz. The story is framed by the giving of an achuzah to Yaakov and his sons, enabling them to settle comfortably in Goshen. In contrast, the main section of the story describes how the Egyptians lose their ownership of the land. In essence, the foreigners became settlers, while the original settlers became foreigners. Yosef's brothers bring their cattle with them and are provided with grazing land in addition to food. The Egyptians, in contrast, are all forced to sell their cattle to Yosef so as to acquire food for themselves. Finally, while Yosef's family proliferates, the Egyptians find themselves on the verge of death. These contrasts between the Israelites and the Egyptians are further emphasized through the mention of the priestly exemption. For these highlight the Israelites' similar dispensation, setting both groups apart from lay Egyptians. So how should Yosef be evaluated? According to Rav David Sabato, Yosef's actions were not only immoral and unfair to the Egyptians, but even stand in opposition to several later Torah commandments. While Yosef worked to give Paro total control over the land, vatihi haaretz leFaro, the Torah states that land can never be sold permanently, for it belongs to Hashem, ki li kol haaretz. The Egyptian people become avadim leFaro, slaves to Paro, while the Torah emphasizes Hashem's role in freeing the children of Israel and forbids eternal bondage to another human, ki avadaihem, for they are my servants. Whereas the priestly exemption allows them to maintain their land, Israelite priests are not given an inheritance at all. They are not above the people, but meant to serve the public. Finally, Yosef commands the people to give a fifth of their produce to Paro, to remind them that all that they eat really belongs to him. The Torah instead commands the nation to tithe for Hashem and his servants, to remind them that all stems from God. It seems that Yosef was viewing Paro as bordering on the divine, forgetting about the true king, Hashem. Others take a less harsh view of Yosef, suggesting that his severe policies and his favoring of his family were more an error in judgment than a flaw in character. Regardless, though, all agree that his actions nonetheless had negative repercussions. First, he bred jealousy and hatred of his family, resentment which was to grow and eventually explode. Moreover, he set a precedent for a totalitarian society in which national bondage is tolerated, paving the way for the Israelite enslavement. We can now move to one final approach. A third reading of our story adopts a neutral view of Yosef and suggests that the story was included not for what it teaches about Yosef, but rather for what it reveals about the dire economic situation in Canaan and how that led to a much longer than anticipated Israelite sojourn in Egypt. This position focuses on the threefold mention of Canaan's impoverishment, suggesting that it comes to emphasize the extent to which Canaan, and not only Egypt, was affected by the famine. All the details regarding the enslavement and displacement of the Egyptians are included in Torah only to highlight the famine's severity. The verses which mention the priestly exemption similarly come to emphasize the totality of the famine's repercussions. The Egyptian priests were the only ones who were unaffected. If this dismal portrait reflects what's going on in Egypt, which had abundant food storehouses, one can imagine that surrounding countries, Canaan included, did not fare much better. In fact, it was very likely that even after the famine, Canaan was in ruins with a collapsed economy. According to this approach, then, had it not been for the economic situation, the family would have returned to Israel immediately after the famine. Only because there was nothing to which to return did they remain in Egypt longer. As such, according to this position too, the story provides a historical backdrop for the events of Sefer Shemot, explaining what led to the initial exile. In summary, we have seen three very different approaches to both Yosef and our story as a whole. Ramban and others laud Yosef, viewing him as an economic genius, and suggest that the goal of the story is simply to highlight this. Modern scholars, in contrast, paint a portrait of an overly harsh despot whose severe policies and accompanying nepotism paved the way for the enslavement. Finally, a third approach views Yosef neutrally, but suggests that the story comes to provide the backdrop not for the bondage, but for the exile itself, answering the question of why the family did not simply return to Canaan at the famine's close. One of the most fascinating aspects of the topic is how commentators can read the same exact verses and come to such diametrically opposed conclusions as to their import and message. As Chazal say, Shiv'im panim la Torah, there are 70 faces to Torah, and that is the beauty of Parshanut. For other topics related to Parshat Vayigash, please visit al-torah.org.